There's not a lot of semantic information in things like model numbers, right? So when you're kind of trying to find a needle in a haystack that doesn't have a lot of rich semantic information in it, you need that hybrid search that will look for keywords.
Hi everyone, I'm Taqi Jaffri, a lead product for UiPath Enterprise Agents. And today I'm joined by Jordan Holcombe, who's one of the engineering managers, also working on agents. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you, Taqi. It's good to be here with you.
Okay, Jordan, so I think a great way to start would be if you could lay out some of the projects your team works on.
Yeah, so my areas are conversational agents and context grounding.
I think maybe if you could walk us through what both of those are at a high level.
Sure. So conversational agents are like chatbots. They're agents that you can talk to. And context grounding, you can think of it like a search and comprehension service for your enterprise data. We bring your data to the agent, so the agent can use that as context to know what kinds of decisions to make and be able to process the inputs and give you the right outputs according to the data that you bring it.
Right, because I think the parametric knowledge of these models, of course, would not include the private data for your enterprise. So if you want the model to answer something that's private to your business, you need to give it the context. So let's get into context grounding a little bit. Can you tell us what products we have as UiPath that we offer to our customers for context grounding, and how do they work?
Sure. This is a service that will allow you to search and comprehend your enterprise data. And going into some of the techniques that we're using behind the scenes is we start the process with extraction, either basic or multimodal extraction. You have the choice when you're ingesting your data. So that's really turning the unstructured data into text so that then it can be retrieved later. Then we do chunking so that you can retrieve individual parts of these documents at search time. Then we go and embed this stuff. It's sending it through sort of like a slice of the LLM, you can think of it, in order to get this big vector that then we use as the semantic information for that chunk. So we take these vectors and the original data, we put them in an index, and then that's the ingestion process. Then at search time, we do a hybrid search. So we're looking for keywords and we're looking for the whole semantic meaning of the query. We'll compute embeddings on the query that comes from the agent, and then we'll go and retrieve those chunks, score them, re-rank them, and give them back to the agent.
Yeah, that's very cool. This sort of RAG style pipelines are pretty common in the industry, but it's pretty interesting that you're doing hybrid search.
Yeah.
So, any reason why it's not just semantic, sort of k nearest neighbor vector search
Yeah.
versus like why do you also mix in the keyword based search? And what techniques do you use, by the way, for the keyword based search?
So we're using the BM25 algorithm. The hybrid search then does a reciprocal rank fusion algorithm in order to produce the scores to mix the different results from the vector search and the keyword search. And the reason you want both is because there's not a lot of semantic information in things like model numbers, right? So when you're kind of trying to find a needle in a haystack that doesn't have a lot of rich semantic information in it, you need that hybrid search that will look for keywords.
And do you also have any thoughts on how do you pick the right chunking strategy? Like, is every page a chunk? Is a paragraph a chunk? Do you have fixed length chunks? Because I can imagine if you over chunk or under chunk, there's some trade offs there as well, right?
Yeah, we've experimented with a bunch of different chunking strategies. I think what works the best is what we call contextualized chunks. So you may have seen a paper from Anthropic maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, where you lose some of the semantic information about the chunk when you go too narrow. So it's a good idea to look at a broader window and maybe rewrite that chunk as if it was an atomic piece of information with all of the context that's needed from the broader window now inside that chunk that you're going to retrieve. So when you return it back to the user, you can return both, right? You can return the rewritten chunk or you can return the original piece of information. You want to do this kind of rewriting in order to have the query match, right? Like if you're in a section that, is talking about, for example, something that's happening in a particular country or state, and that's sort of up in the header, but down in the chunk, you've lost that information, and the user is asking something about that particular country or state. You want to make sure you're able to retrieve that.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovation in these RAG pipelines, so that's super cool. Okay, I think let's also maybe now switch a little bit to conversational agents, the other area that you work on. So, what really distinguishes in your mind a conversational agent from an unattended or autonomous agent?
Right. So an autonomous agent is something that can run as part of a scheduled job. You don't have to watch it. It has a beginning and an end. It has an input and an output. Conversational agent is something that you're going to be talking to either through text or through voice. It's something that you're going to be sitting in front of. And it has many inputs and many outputs over the course of the conversation.
Yeah, so it can be multimodal, both in terms of inputs and outputs, right?
Yeah.
So you can give it image attachments, it can even produce structured content out, etc. I can imagine it's challenging from a latency perspective. So how do you handle essentially a user sitting there waiting for a very long answer to come back?
We have streaming, and we have a bunch of different tricks on the back end to make sure that we've warmed up the right resources. Yeah, I think streaming is the biggest thing. When the agent has a long response, you don't want to wait to the end before you can start reading.
Exactly, because sometimes the agent is writing essentially a research report or something like that.
Yeah.
Very cool. And I think, have you looked a little bit into these so-called deep agents, deep agent architectures, which can do a lot of very interesting things, including code gen, for example, to do a few things. Is that something you're looking into?
Absolutely. So with deep agents, you need a plan, you need a scratch pad, and you need a special prompt in order to be able to refine your plan over time and make efficient use of this scratch pad where you're writing stuff on the side. So we have, as part of the context grounding product, sort of a preliminary version of a deep agent that we call deep rag.
Yeah, walk us through how deep rag works, maybe.
Sure. So instead of retrieving little bits of the document, there are some cases where the agent really needs to understand the entire document. And so for documents or sets of documents up to or less than 1,000 pages, we can go through and with like a big prompt of everything that you want out of this document, distill that down. And this needs to run, it needs to kind of generate a plan, it needs to extract key sentences and kind of do a hierarchical summarization to reduce this large amount of content down to just what the agent needs to know about that document.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's kind of like if the task that you're trying to do on the document is more complex that you can do one shot with an LLM,
Yeah.
you need to break it down into multiple steps and execute them. Wonderful. So we've talked about conversational agents, we've talked about context, but UiPath has this promise that our agents are enterprise grade.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what does that mean operationally? How do you make sure they actually work at scale in production and they're not just fun little prototypes?
Yeah. So for conversational agents, there was a learning that we had after we released our Autopilot for Everyone product, which was a general purpose conversational agents. This allowed people to get started with using LLMs within the context of having all your tools that you can build with UiPath. What we saw is that when people are using these at work, they're using them in a purpose-built way. So for building a reliable conversational agent, you really need that build experience in order to make this thing purpose-built. You want to give it specific tools for a specific task. You want to narrow in on the kind of system prompt and user prompt that you need for that task. And then you need things like evals, right?
Yeah.
So imagine I'm developing this conversational agent and I want to see how it's running. I can go ahead and drop into that conversation during the build experience. And then as I have a conversation that I expect my users to have, I can go and click add to eval, and that captures everything. and then it sort of becomes part of a test set.
So I think that's great to make sure you're designing the agent and you're testing it at build time. But now imagine the agent is deployed to production. I imagine there's tracing, there's P95 sort of evals on its latency. Like, how do you make sure it's not falling over in production once somebody has nicely evaluated it in the lab?
That's a great question. So we have our agents landing page, which will show several different statistics on both how your context grounding indexes are being used, as well as your conversational agents.
Mm-hmm.
So you can monitor them as they've been deployed. You can see how many conversations have happened, how many queries are there. You can see the health of them.
Got it. And a lot of UiPath's customers are very security conscious.
Mm-hmm.
They're in highly regulated industries. Some of them are distributed geographically. So maybe you can just summarize briefly, as part of the UiPath platform, what do we offer these security conscious customers?
There are several different things. So we have, as part of our LLM gateway, PII detection and scrubbing. We have, as part of multi-tenant cloud offering, we have multiple different regions.
Mhm.
We have RBAC governance in Orchestrator. So every conversational agent, every context grounding index is tied to an Orchestrator folder, which is sort of our entity where we manage the RBAC for access to these things. I'm sure there's things I'm missing, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I think the whole point that you made at the end around tenant scoping and making sure that all data is isolated to a particular customer, that bears repeating.
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want is sort of data cross pollination between tenants for these highly security conscious customers. Okay, thank you so much, Jordan, for your time. Super important to hear from you, right from the engineering manager leading some of these teams. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taqi.